I had no reason to expect an inheritance. No one in my family was particularly wealthy, and the few distant relatives I could name had all either passed away or faded into irrelevance. Yet, one day, a letter arrived, thick and yellowed at the edges, informing me that I had come into possession of a house. It had belonged to a great-aunt I had never met, her name a vague recollection from family gossip, Margaret Wren. The details were sparse, just an address and a formal statement of transfer. No sentimental notes, no explanations. A house, mine by default, simply because there was no one else left to claim it. The house sat on the outskirts of a quiet town, surrounded by woods that pressed in from all sides. A place meant to be forgotten. The architecture was a mix of styles, like it had been built in stages, patched together over decades. The roof slanted unevenly, and ivy climbed the stone walls, creeping toward windows fogged with dust. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and varnish, with something deeper beneath, an old, lingering must, like pages in a forgotten book. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something heavier, something that pressed against the walls, waiting. Then I saw them. Puppets. Hundreds of them. Lined on shelves, hanging from hooks, sitting on chairs. Some were as small as a child's hand, others life-sized, slumped in corners like discarded mannequins. They were everywhere. Their faces were carved with impossible precision, expressions frozen in moments of exaggerated joy, sorrow, surprise. Glass eyes caught the light from the high windows, reflections shifting as I moved through the rooms. Their wooden hands were sculpted down to the last detail, veins, fingernails, even the faintest impressions of knuckles. Some had strings attached, limp and tangled. Others lay stiff and unmoving, as if waiting for direction. It took effort not to feel unsettled. They were just antiques, I told myself. Part of an eccentric collection, the hobby of a woman long gone. But as I walked deeper into the house, it was impossible to ignore the feeling of being watched. The way their faces always seemed to be turned just slightly in my direction. I forced rationality to take over. Old houses came with their quirks. Drafts, warped floorboards, and of course, the odd collection of unsettling decor. It wasn't like I had to keep them. The first chance I got, I would pack them away, sell them, donate them, or simply leave them in the attic to gather dust. That first night, I found the master bedroom undisturbed, the furniture covered in sheets like forgotten ghosts. I settled into the bed, exhausted from the long drive, the weight of the house pressing down on me like an unspoken expectation. Sleep came fitfully. At first, just the usual sounds, branches against the window, the faint groan of wood settling. But then, something else. A clicking noise, light, deliberate, like the tapping of tiny feet against the wooden floor. It started in the hallway. Slow, measured steps, stopping just outside the door. I held my breath, listening. The sound did not continue, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. Then a shift. The faintest creak of weight easing onto a floorboard. I forced myself to exhale, pushing aside the creeping unease. It had to be the house settling, the old wood shifting as the temperature dropped. Maybe even mice. Of course, a house like this would have them. The darkness felt thicker, the air in the room pressing closer. My skin prickled, the instinctive alertness that comes when something is near. Still, nothing moved. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, willing myself to ignore it. The sound did not come again. But as I drifted towards sleep, one final thought settled into my mind, quiet and unwelcome. I had locked the door, hadn't I? The first night could be explained away. The house was old, and old houses made noise. Settling wood, shifting air currents, the occasional rodent scurrying behind the walls. There was always a rational explanation. But the noises didn't stop. Each night they grew worse. It was never just the floorboards creaking. Whispers, soft and indistinct, rose from the hallways, weaving through the darkness like threads of conversation just beyond comprehension. No words, only the cadence of voices, too many to count. A low, rhythmic murmur, as though the house itself was breathing. Objects were not where I had left them. The chair in the study, once facing the desk, now turned slightly toward the door. A drawer I was certain had been closed now stood ajar, its contents undisturbed but undeniably shifted. Even the dust, which had lain thick over everything when I arrived, bore the faintest disturbances, tracks, as if something small had moved through it in the night. And yet, the puppets never moved. Each morning, I found them exactly as I'd left them, their wooden faces frozen in silent expressions. I checked their positions obsessively, cataloging them in my mind, searching for proof of what I already knew, that something was changing, that the house was shifting around me while I slept. Then, on the fourth morning, I woke to find one sitting at the foot of my bed. It hadn't been there the night before. Its glassy eyes stared at me, its carved lips slightly parted as if on the verge of speaking. A small wooden hand rested delicately on the blanket, the fingers curled as though they had just released their grip. A deep unease settled into my stomach, thick and unmoving. There had to be an explanation. I had moved it. Somewhere in my sleep, in a moment of unconsciousness, I had carried it here, set it down with purpose. The thought sent a slow, crawling sensation through my limbs, the kind that made my skin feel too tight. I needed proof. That night, I set up cameras. One in the hallway, one in the living room, and one in my bedroom, angled toward the bed. If I was sleepwalking, I needed to see it for myself. The house was silent when I lay down, the whispers absent for the first time in days. I forced myself to relax, to keep my breathing steady, though the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on me. Sleep came in waves, thick and cloying, dragging me under. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. A heaviness clung to my limbs, as if I had not slept at all. The house was unchanged, the puppets unmoved, but I didn't check the footage right away. Something about it unsettled me. The certainty that I would find an answer I didn't want. Hours passed before I finally sat in front of my laptop, fingers hovering over the trackpad, breath shallow and uneven. The first hour of footage was still. The bedroom camera showed nothing but the steady rise and fall of my chest, the faint shifting of blankets. At 3:12 a.m., I sat up. The movement was sudden, unnatural, like a marionette pulled upright by invisible strings. My head turned slightly, as though listening to something just outside the range of the microphone. Then I stood, slow, deliberate, no hesitation. I watched myself move to the shelves, hands reaching out to touch the puppets with a gentleness that sent ice through my veins. One by one, I repositioned them, tilting their heads, adjusting their arms. A silent, practiced routine. And then I spoke. The camera had no audio, but my lips moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, forming words I could not hear. My expression never changed, calm, serene, almost reverent. I moved to the hallway, and the second camera picked up my descent down the stairs. The living room camera caught the moment I paused, standing perfectly still in the center of the room, my face angled toward the ceiling. Then I smiled. It was not my smile. Something in the shape of it, the precise way the corners of my lips lifted, was wrong. Unnatural. Too deliberate. I reached for something out of frame. When I stepped back into view, I was holding a carving knife. I shut the laptop. The house was silent around me, but I could feel it watching. Sleep had become an enemy. After watching the footage, I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes, couldn't risk losing another night to something I didn't understand. The memory of that smile haunted me, the precise way my lips had curled, the calculated tilt of my head. It wasn't mine. I needed control. The journal became my tether to reality. If I could keep track of my thoughts, my actions, then I could prove to myself that I was still in control. I wrote obsessively, recording every detail, what I ate, where I sat, the exact placement of every puppet. They hadn't moved since I started keeping track, but that only made me more uneasy. It was as if they were waiting. The house felt heavier, like the air had thickened. The once quiet murmurs had grown clearer, still indistinct, but no longer just whispers. They wove around the edges of my thoughts, nudging, coaxing, a presence pressing against my mind like unseen fingers tracing the edges of a mask. I refused to let it in. I forced myself to stay awake, pen moving across paper, hand cramping from the effort. I cataloged everything. My own breathing, the way the candlelight flickered against the wooden faces, the time, the date. The repetition was grounding, a ritual against whatever was creeping into my mind. Then I blinked. The journal was no longer in my lap. It was in my hands, open to a page I didn't remember writing. The ink was mine, familiar, unmistakable, but the words were not. You were almost ready. The pen slipped from my fingers. I was no longer in my chair. The room was gone. I stood in the hallway, feet cold against the wooden floor. The air smelled of varnish and dust, thick with something sickly sweet beneath it. My fingers tingled, aching with the phantom sensation of movement, as if I had been working, shaping, carving. At my feet, the puppets sat in a circle. They were arranged deliberately, their glassy eyes all turned toward the center. Their limbs positioned as if they had been placed mid-conversation, some leaning toward one another, others frozen in gestures of silent agreement. One rested in my hands, an old marionette, larger than the others, its limbs loose but carefully jointed. It had glass blue eyes, wide and watching, its mouth carved into the suggestion of a smile. It fit in my grip too perfectly, the weight of it familiar, like something I had held 100 times before. I couldn't breathe. The journal had been in my hands. The candle had been flickering. I had been writing. I had been awake. Hadn't I? The silence pressed against my ears, deafening in its weight. Then something moved. Not a creak of settling wood, not the wind against the windows. Something shifted. The puppets did not change, their positions unchanged, but the air felt different, as if the house had exhaled. I needed to leave. The marionette tumbled from my hands as I turned, heavy against the floor. My footsteps were too loud as I rushed toward the front door, my heartbeat hammering in my chest, in my throat. I didn't think. I just reached for the handle, fingers closing around it with desperate relief. It didn't turn. The lock was engaged. I hadn't locked it. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket, searching for my keys, the cold metal familiar against my fingertips. But when I pulled my hand free, I wasn't holding keys. A wooden hand, tiny, carved in delicate detail, the grain of the wood running smoothly beneath my thumb. The fingers were curled slightly, almost lifelike, the nails etched into the surface with impossibly fine craftsmanship. It had weight. It had warmth. It had come from something. The murmurs returned, closer now. Not whispers, not distant voices. A puppeteer just beyond the edge of the strings. The wooden hand sat in my palm, impossibly smooth. It felt warm as though it had been carved moments ago, as if fingers had only just curled into mine. I let it slip from my grasp, hearing the small, hollow sound as it hit the floor. My breath was shallow, heart hammering against my ribs as I tried the door again. Still locked. The knob refused to budge, the deadbolt frozen in place. I needed to find another way out. The house stretched around me, unfamiliar in its familiarity. Every hallway felt longer than before, every corner hiding something just out of sight. My own reflection in the dusty mirrors seemed delayed, as if it was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. The air smelled of wood and varnish, the scent stronger than before. It clung to my skin, seeping into my clothes. It wasn't just the puppets. The house smelled of it. The walls, the floor, even the dust carried that sharp, chemical sweetness. My thoughts spiraled. I had to do something, find an explanation, find a way out. I moved through the house, hands skimming over the walls, searching. In the dim light, I noticed something strange. The grain of the wood on one of the baseboards didn't match. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The pattern was different, the color slightly richer. There was something behind it. My fingers dug into the edge, splinters biting into my skin as I pried the panel loose. Behind it, a seam in the wall. A hidden door. The cabinet beside it was heavy, but something in me knew it had to be moved. I pushed, shoulder against the wood, feet scraping against the floor until the weight gave way, revealing the outline of a narrow doorway. I hesitated. The air beyond the door was heavier, thicker. The smell of varnish and polish was overwhelming, clinging to the back of my throat. I stepped inside. The basement was darker than I expected, colder. The stone walls held moisture, the air damp despite the scent of drying wood. Shadows loomed in the corners, shifting as I moved deeper into the space. Then the workshop, tables covered in sawdust, half-carved pieces of wood stacked neatly in rows. Sculpting tools, chisels, gouges, carving knives, laid out with meticulous precision. Shelves lined the walls, each one filled with wooden limbs. Arms, hands, legs, torsos, some unfinished, rough edges still marked by knife strokes. Others were disturbingly smooth, polished to perfection, their joints expertly crafted. In the center of the room, something sat under a cloth. My stomach twisted. I stepped forward, fingers hesitating before gripping the edge of the fabric. The cloth slid away. A puppet, half-carved, its features unfinished, but I knew them. The curve of the cheek, the slope of the nose, the familiar set of the jaw. The wooden face was my own. My breath caught. The puppet stared up at me with unseeing eyes, its mouth slightly open as if about to speak. The wood was fresh, the grain soft where the carving had not been completed. The hands were missing. I staggered back, knocking into one of the shelves. Something toppled, landing with a heavy thud against the floor. A head, carved, lifeless, but unmistakably mine. I turned, eyes scanning the shelves. More heads, dozens, each identical, yet different, some with serene expressions, others twisted in agony. One smiling, one crying, one utterly blank. The variations were subtle, but each one was me. A deep nausea settled in my stomach, spreading like something rotten. My hand shook as I reached for the work table, papers scattered across its surface. The pages were brittle with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. The transformation is almost complete. The next page, written in the same careful script. The old wood must be replaced. And below it, the final line, written over and over in frantic repetition. The new wood must be carved. The scent of varnish was suffocating. The workshop wasn't for the puppets. It was for me. The smell of varnish clung to my skin, the weight of it sinking into my lungs. The workshop pulsed with an unspoken presence, the wooden heads lining the shelves staring down at me with empty, motionless eyes. My own face, replicated, distorted, screaming in silence. I couldn't stay. I forced myself back up the stairs, leaving behind the half-carved replica, the papers scrawled with warnings that had come too late. My limbs felt unsteady, my balance unfamiliar, as if the floor beneath me had shifted. My hand still trembled as I locked the basement door behind me, as if that thin barrier of wood could keep out whatever it was. The house had grown heavier. The whispers that had once been distant now clung to the walls, seeping into every crevice. I could feel them skimming over my skin like phantom hands. Not whispers anymore, not distant. Right here, I needed proof. The cameras had been recording. They had to show me what was happening. I forced myself to sit in front of the laptop, pressing play on the footage from the night before. The first few hours were still, just my sleeping form beneath the covers. Then at 3:12 a.m. movement. I sat up abruptly, back straight, movements too controlled, too deliberate. Not groggy, not hesitant, like something had pulled my strings. I watched as I moved through the room, my steps unervingly smooth. The same routine as before, rearranging the puppets, adjusting their limbs, murmuring words I couldn't hear. But then something changed. I turned toward the dresser. The camera caught it perfectly. How I reached down, fingers closing around something. A carving knife. A slow, careful movement as I lifted it. My arm extended, the blade pressing against the skin of my forearm. No hesitation. No pain. Just a smooth, practiced slice. The skin peeled back. Not blood, not muscle. Beneath the cut, the raw, pale surface of what gleamed under the dim light. I didn't react. Not a wince, not a flinch. The footage showed my face perfectly calm, my lips parting in an expression of realization. No, not realization. Understanding. I watched myself continue, cutting deeper, exposing the grain beneath the surface. I traced the edge of the knife along my wrist, along my thigh, revealing more. The thing inside me wasn't flesh, wasn't human. It had never been. Then, the most horrifying moment. I moved to the work table. The half-carved puppet, the one with my face, sat waiting for me. The footage showed me reaching for it, cradling it in my arms with the kind of care reserved for something beloved. My fingers traced over its features, adjusting its position, ensuring its limbs were perfect. And then I smiled. That same unnatural, vacant smile I had seen before. But the footage wasn't over. In the final moments, I turned slowly, staring directly at the camera. My gaze locked onto the lens, my expression serene. Then, something shifted behind me. In the reflection of the dresser mirror, something else was standing in the room. Another figure, mouth open, eyes blank, unmoving. The original version of me. A lifeless puppet discarded. The footage ended. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at my hands. My fingers trembled, nails pressing against my skin, against the surface beneath. Beneath the flesh. Beneath the wood.